I would just like to thank Allison for inviting me to speak with you today, and to Rana El Baharani, who organized this event. I'm excited to share with you all some of my work and thoughts on transparency and decision-making processes and why that's important. And I'm eager to hear your questions and your thoughts about all of this. And so I want to kind of begin to talk to you about how I became thinking about transparency and positionality as in parallel, right, as they come together, and then how they came together in this novel methodological tool my research team and I are calling the Living Codebook. So first, what is transparency, right? It's about being open and clear. There's actually, I would argue, and you can see this in my 2019 book, the methodological appendix of it, that it's important to differentiate what we're talking about when we're talking about transparency. And in fact, often when we talk about quantitative work and qualitative work, we're actually talking about two different things. First, there's transparency in the data analysis stage, right? So this is often sharing codes, replicating models, rerunning analyses, data repositories. It's a transparent process that involves researchers disclosing what they did with raw data that they've collected. And this comprises the bulk of the discussion about transparency, transparent guidelines, and policies concerning quantitative research, right? Second, there is transparency in the data collection stage. This involves being open about the who, the what, the where, the when, and why of data collection. Yet qualitative data typically contains sensitive identifying information, right? So scholars have a harder time sharing. And because these identifying details aren't included and others cannot easily run models to analyze raw qualitative data, and data collection tends to primarily be the focus when academics, journalists, advocate for open science when they discuss qualitative work. But I would argue that they're actually arguing for something very different than what they argue for in quantitative work, right? There's very little discussion about how the people who actually do the surveys that quantitative work is based on. I used to work at a call center and you read a script, but it matters kind of who is on the call and who's not. And so I'd argue this difference between analysis and data collection is really important because there are just different standards, applications, guidelines, foci with regard to each. And really, I have been feeling when we talk about transparency that really qualitative and quantitative researchers are talking past one another precisely because they're talking about different stages of research. And so my argument, right, I also have a 2018 paper if you're interested in kind of the 3 different models of transparency in ethnographic work, naming places, naming people, and sharing data. But I really believe that we should be marked by transparency in the decision-making processes, why we make the decisions we do, and that, in fact, there should not be a default way of being transparent. Rather, the default should be the explanation, justification regarding why we make the decisions we do, how this differs based on projects, purposes, and goals, that we need to be informed by our ethical considerations, right? Science has caused a lot of harm by being science at all costs, and it's not. We have ethical responsibilities above and beyond our immediate kind of careers, and we have an obligation to think about the intended and unintended consequences, short-term and long-term consequences of our work with our participants, right? So what about positionality? What is positionality? So positionality is another term for our varied and multiple social positions. It's thinking about how our positionality shapes our entrance, our interactions, our conversations with the field, how we kind of think about the field and the people and relationships. And this is a core tenet of qualitative research and represents one model of science. And so I have a 2020 paper where I talk about what I call the ethnographic toolkit. And it really thinks about how, as researchers, we both have visible tools, whether it's our presenting gender, race, and invisible tools. So that could be things like our social capital, right? Who we know, our cultural capital, our family backgrounds that we actually use in the course of our research, right? That we are the tool, we are active, and that sometimes we're more successful and other times we're not successful, right? Just because we kind of employ a strategy doesn't mean we're always successful with our participants or in particular kind of interactions. And so but this is important, positionality is important, and particularly thinking about our role as researchers, because we're active and strategic in the course of field work, right? Like with an emphasis on different strategies, depending on the person and situation, and thinking about how successful or unsuccessful, right? So all of this has kind of come together and thinking about how transparency and positionality works in practice in the case of qualitative team coding. So I've recently, I don't know, I started the project before my 2019 book was published, but I am working on it's largely right now document based, but I have field work kind of grant writing to do more field work about reputation of place, and in particular Subic Bay and Manila, and it's a comparison. And so I have a whole wide variety of textual documents, from newspapers to social media to, you know, reputation websites like TripAdvisor, etc. And so I have recently published online first 2021 in sociological methods and research called the Living Codebook, with two graduate students who work on the team with me, Elizabeth Bogomil and Levin Welch. And here we argue that many scholars should think about creating a living codebook, which is a set of tools that documents the data analysis process. So it consists of 4 parts: a processual database that keeps track of initial codes, and a final database that keeps track of completed codes, definitions and key terms lists that keeps conversations about how codes are made, a memo writing. So Charmaine's is kind of a classic book in qualitative work, we draw on her. And then what the most novel part is this difference list, which explains the rationale behind unmatched codes. So what this does is it allows researchers to interrogate taken for granted assumptions about what data they focus on, why and how to analyze it. And in doing so, it moves kind of beyond discussions about intercoder reliability, like, did you both match this one code or not? And it's about the process in which we create analytic codes, refine them, and debate them, right? So it's a way to document how decisions are made, how concepts of the bounds of concepts arise, and the backstage kind of decision-making behind qualitative data analysis. And it reveals how many codes are situationally dependent and highlights the need for people in the coding process, because words need to be read in context and understand how they relate to one another. So a common kind of thing for big data is just to count the number of words. But in our work, we see that the same word means very different things depending on the context. So I do want to note that it's important to note that our call for a living codebook shouldn't be read as a reification of quantitative methods, as a more pure science from which qualitative scholars need to draw on in order to justify qualitative methods, right? What this does is it offers one way to document how definitions are arrived, the bounds of concepts, backstage decision-making processes. But to be clear, we don't think that everyone needs to use this, that just like in issues of transparency need to be on a project by project basis, so too whether or not and how to use Living Codebook need to be made on a case-by-case basis, depending on the data and the goals of the research. This just adds a kind of another tool in our qualitative team research kind of toolkit. So I just wanted to briefly explain kind of what each of these 4 moving parts are. The first is a processual database. And here I've been working with over 35 undergraduate research assistants here at UCR, and they had been coding TripAdvisor reviews of like hotels and activities in and around Subic Bay and Olongapo. And so what this does, and the processual database is not kind of prescriptive in terms of it has to look like this. It's very much flexible. The point is to keep track of who codes who. So when I code myself with a graduate research assistant, we don't necessarily have all these columns. What we can see is we have research assistant A, research assistant B. And what this does is it helps walk through, in addition to readings and conversations, undergraduates in the research process. So keyword review is this column where I have kind of the undergraduate research assistants kind of look at the review and pull out what we would call in vivo codes. So that's codes from the data, right? And it's to help them think about keyword thematic, which are the analytic codes, right? And we have a whole list of codes, but the keyword review is kind of this bridge from the data itself to the analytic codes. Then in TripAdvisor, the overall rating, like we think about, is it positive? Is it negative? Is it mixed? Right? And so this is the basis, and each research assistant kind of looks at their own codes, and we do this. Then what happens is we also have this other part, and this is the role of me as the kind of researcher lead, is that I then compare these two and think about what are the same codes, what are the different codes, and then we have a conversation and we add what are the deleted codes and added codes. So actually what I want to do, since we're online and I could do this, is I pulled up. So this is in summer 2021, this most recent summer. I was working with two undergraduate research assistants, paying them for a grant I got. And so this is how we kind of put together one of the TripAdvisor reviews. And so you can see it has like, I do search term from like Subic Bay Freeport Zone, Olongapo, like the city name, what it is, what type of it is, whether it's a hotel, a things to do or whatever, the name of the reviewer, contributed level, location of review, date of visit, title of review, and then just putting the review itself, right? Copying, pasting, so you always have it. And so researchers don't have to keep going back to PDFs. And then you could see these are, you know, Christy and Max. And so sometimes the undergraduates like to kind of, that helps them keep track of this. But so these are the kind of in vivo codes, the keyword reviews. These are the keyword, the analytic key terms, the overall rating. And then Max was the other person. And so what I did is then we have same codes. So these were the codes that both of them had. And then these are the codes that neither had. And so in this in particular, what this means, right? So you see codes like this, the comparisons means that was a code that one of them had, but the other didn't. And the ones in parentheses, I actually go through and I look at and see if they miss any of the codes, right? So it's a way of like double and triple checking kind of codes. And oftentimes, it's really helpful because coding is so tedious, right? and so it's helpful to kind of go back and review. And so this is kind of what the database kind of looks like. And this is what they were working on for the summer. So let me get back to this. And so then we actually have two separate databases. One is the processual database, which is what I tend to work on. I'm working with the undergraduate research assistants. And so, and you could see kind of, it has the key characteristics of each review. It has columns by research assistant, documents the similarities, differences, which codes are added, which codes are deleted, and then final codes. A final database, right? This is what a regular database would be most people, which is key characteristics of the review, and then the column of final codes. You know, maybe a separate column for each analytic code, but it just has the end process, right? And so that final database is important, but really the processual database documents kind of the decisions that are made, and it's to do that systematically. So the next part is a definitions and key terms list. So here again, often, you know, a regular code book in quantitative research has like a list of codes and their definitions. But in fact, especially when you're creating a new project, how these things are analyzed, right, is not obvious. How, what they refer to, what they don't refer to is not obvious. And so here, again, it's a way to keep track, I would argue, a way to keep track of the conversations we have. So here you can see Elizabeth, she was asking about, do we code guests, right? Is this complaints about guests? What are we trying to do with the guests? Is it, it's anyone who's not a staff member, but would it also include like vendors who come in, and what is the bounds of this concept if we have complaints about guest to guest versus something else? And so here again, I can kind of show you what that looks like in practice, which is, you can see I have a lot of, so we actually have two versions. One is a clean version that doesn't have these discussions, and the other one is the basis. So we're thinking about like, how do we define what's something positive, negative, mixed, or neutral, right? And you could see that in the different comments are color coded, right? And so here's a question. And so this is where, I mean, we weren't even working in, it was in the before times, but when you have multiple teams, right, it's hard to get all together. And like for the first year, the graduate assistants were working with their own teams. After the first year, I worked with all the undergraduates. But in order to communicate, we did these Google Docs, right? And it's a way to like, oh yeah, so we are including this, we are going to include that, but it's not obvious how things, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's not obvious how things are defined, especially in the course of research and when you dig deep into the data. Next is we really just draw on Kathy Charmez and her kind of grounded theory, constructing grounded theory. And here it's really, all the rage now is kind of abductive analysis, and Timmermans and Tavery. And I think that their work is really amazing. And it's thinking about this co-constitutive nature of theory and data, et cetera. Charmez also talks about that a lot in her version of grounded theory. But here, I think keeping track of undergraduates and their thinking as they're going through the data, because they'll know the data best than me, is to write memos. And so here we actually have three parts of the memo. It's coding. So again, we say you don't have to write all of these questions or answers every time, but these are prompts to think about, like, what are people doing? What are they saying? Like, what does it make you think of? What are some comparisons? Then kind of just reflections, like a meta reflection on the coding process itself. Like, is it clear, right? Do you need clarification? Are the documents helpful? How has this changed from beginning to now? And often it gets much easier, right? And then a part on reflexivity. So how are they relating to these themes and thinking about, I work with a lot of marginal students from marginalized communities, underrepresented students, and thinking about like how, especially the Filipino students I work with, and I'm Filipina myself, we think about like our own experiences and what are we seeing and how does that compare with people who don't, and it's kind of opens up the conversation. Or it could be as little as, oh, well, when I go to wherever and I go to a hotel, I kind of can relate, or maybe I can't relate, but it's a way to just step back and think about the process. Next is the difference list, right? So you saw, and this is the most novel part, you saw before that we have kind of different codes, and there are codes where either one person coded and the other didn't. And then there are codes I read through, and if there are codes I think are missing, I add that, right? So here you can kind of see student A. Here there were kind of three different codes, and some of this is just mundane, right? That's part of research. And so then a student has to think about, like, why did they if they added the code, why did they think to add the code? If they didn't, would they add it again? So again, we're online, so we can have the funness of kind of going through all this, and I can see it in real time, kind of the what it does in action, right? So this is the difference list, and you can see often, sometimes, sometimes they agree a lot, but other times there are a lot of things, but they say, I didn't code, but I should have for one of the reasons, right? So this is where rereading and returning to codes multiple times is super important, because we miss things all the time. And again, we have this differentiation between coding mismatched codes from them. And then the second parentheses is like what I thought should have been added, but wasn't added. And then we talk about that. And I talk about why I thought it should have been added. And we have an open conversation about it. And as you can see, we also at the end decision, do we add it? We decided to add these codes. We decided to delete these codes, right? So you do that. And then, so the actual process is there's a lot of moving parts and it's come together. So really what tends to happen is, say in a given week, this is assuming after training, right? So you train kind of your research assistants and thinking about different readings, and you do practice codes together and we talk about the process. And then we start going, and each team, and usually these are teams of 2, I have worked with teams of 3, those can get kind of messy, but usually it's 2 undergraduate research assistants. Each team is given a set of material to code with a deadline by the end of the week. So it could range from like 10 reviews to code to 20 reviews to code. Soon after the deadline, the team leader, me, I go through and I kind of create this difference list, right? Based on differences in codes among the undergraduate research assistants, right? And I put this in same codes, different codes, in the processual database. I create the difference list, list out the codes, and then I alert the team, oh, the difference list is ready. And then week 2, what they do is they spend their time filling out the difference list, so explaining why they did or did not put a given code for each review. And then they also write their memo during that time. And the team meeting is held, we go over the memos, and then we discuss the difference list, right? And so that's kind of, it is regular kind of deadlines, and it allows us to kind of break up the stage, the coding versus the kind of difference list. And often the difference list, it always takes the students I work with a lot longer than anticipating to kind of actually explain, but it's such an important part of the process, because I always tell them, and this is also helpful for myself, is that what's obvious to us, or it's obvious to you, is not always obvious to the reader. We document these stuff because a year from now, when I go back through this, I'm not going to remember our conversations, right? And so documenting these things allows, for example, me as the researcher to go back and look at the themes. That's why the memos are important. It helps kind of highlight things I should be looking for, and what, like, the undergraduate research assistants who are in the midst of the coding, the themes they saw. That, so when I go back and I kind of, do my kind of more meta-analysis, et cetera, I can kind of do that. Yeah. And so then open it up to questions. I'd love to chat with all of you. Any kind of questions or comments you have. Thanks.
Well, others are thinking, I'll ask one. When you, as you've been working with what it means to publish the results, where you've been using the Living Codebook, how do you think about how that's changing your write-ups?
Yeah, do you mean the write-ups in terms of the memos of the data, or in terms of of the paper itself?
The paper itself, summarizing your methodology, being able to talk about sort of what you're providing. I don't know if you're actually putting things in data repositories. Like, I'm curious how this fits with the process of publishing.
Yeah, well, so the first paper from this project was this methodology paper that kind of lays out the Living Codebook and a way to use it. I have been in the midst of drafting another paper based on results, but that is in a very early stage. I workshopped it in Geneva the January before the shutdowns. So literally like 2 months before the shutdowns, I was able to go to Geneva, which was fun. But honestly, with COVID, I couldn't concentrate on this kind of really complex moving parts empirical work. I did a bunch of different kind of writing. I have a book under contract based on that, but I'm only now kind of getting back to it and thinking about it. So I think that this is a conversation I'm just beginning to rehab. I think what I can do is refer back to kind of the already published paper, and I can talk about it, and I can think about my data and method section would probably center on that and thinking about how I've used it. And again, for particular, the Living Codebook looks different from, for example, when I coded pictures with one of the graduate student assistants, and we didn't have, the keyword review. So it's supposed to be flexible. All of that is to say, I think I haven't published another paper based on the content, so I can't really answer your question. But I just anticipate like it would be a reference to the sociological methods and research paper and elaborate it as it relates to the kind of specific questions of that paper. Do you want me to call on people or Catherine?
Yeah, here you go for it. Oh, you're muted.
Still learning to use Zoom 2 years later. My name's Katie. I'm in the political science department here at Mac. Thanks for the talk. It was so interesting. And I'm just thinking about ways that I might be able to employ some of these really neat ideas. And I think you answered part of my question in your response to Allison, but could you talk a little bit more about how this stage of the research fits into your kind of overall analysis of the results? And I mean, I'd be interested to hear a little bit about like the goals of the TripAdvisor research, to kind of envision how the process that you've described will fit into those results.
Yeah, great. So one of the, TripAdvisor may seem like a strange, odd data, we, especially quantitative or positivistic or post-positivistic researchers are like, well, it's biased. And so what's the use of this? But in fact, I think everything is biased. And I think the biases is the point. And so part of it is why I have a wide range. I mean, this is now, I did not think it would be like as big of a project as it has gotten. It's almost too unwieldy. But we have, I have data from newspapers, multiple newspapers in the Philippines. I have New York Times from the US. I have newspapers from Australia, Japan, Korea, the UAE, and all about how they talk about Subic Bay and Manila. So I have newspaper. I have actually, because this might be helpful to think about is, oh no, I don't want to. Let's see if I can find it. Maybe I won't be able to in this time. But the purpose is like the different audiences, right? There are different audiences and how people are talked about, and how all of this happens matters. And that's part of kind of the reputation. So in economic sociology, there is this kind of perspective called cultural wealth, and it talks about how myths. Oh, actually, it's in my NSF. I just recently wrote an NSF about this project to get money to hire more people. So that is what I'm thinking of. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if this is the table. So sorry. Trying to do multiple things is not a great thing. What was I saying? So the point is that how reputations shape economic activity of cities, right? And in fact, that there are multiple reputations, right? And so here I draw on a lot of the kind of humanities research. But here, my data sources, I have Everyday Talk, right? TripAdvisor, Reddit, US military related websites, because the Philippines was a former colony of the United States. I have Twitter, and this NSF is for interviews with people in Manila and Subic Bay. Mediascapes, I have the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the New York Times, and all of these different things. I also have travel guides, and then I have what I call official stories. So that's interviews with, this is my NSF, Philippine National City and Freeport Zone tourism websites, because this Freeport Zone has its own government, and embassy and foreign travel advice documents from Australia, Japan, South Korea, UAE, and US. So the actual point of the project is that there are a lot of different reputations, and which kinds of reputations shape what kinds of economic activity, right? And so, and how does this relate to Filipino officials' ability to kind of transform these places, for example, from a military base to kind of you know, a more cosmopolitan city, and attract. And so it's a way in which reputation is sticky and we can analyze. And so it is just a huge project. And I'm, you know, so I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense. So the project is not just based on TripAdvisor, but that's what I've been working with undergraduates. And it's precisely about, because if you think about it, right, oftentimes people go and ask other people their understanding of different places are based on talking with other people, reading newspapers, social media websites, you know, and each country has their own kind of specific ones. Yelp, you know, we go to Yelp, or, oh, we have, you know, all of these different kind of reputation devices. And so for me, it's kind of thinking about it at a larger scale and how can we connect it to economic activity. I'm an economic sociologist. So does that kind of help answer the question a little bit more?
Yeah, thanks. That's fascinating.
Yeah, Grant?
Hi, thanks for your talk. I teach reproducibility and research transparency mostly for quantitative stuff, but I was really interested to hear what you're doing. I'm not a qualitative person, so there's a lot of stuff that went over my head. But could you maybe comment on? I'm assuming the same thing happens for you that happens for me in qualitative, is that it seems like it's more work, but actually because of efficiencies and streamlining, it winds up, you know, making your projects more efficient. Can you tell us about some of how it happens, if it does? Or is this more about, you know, transparency and just improving the quality of your empirical work?
Yeah, you know, to be honest, I do not think that this is a more efficient process. I mean, that's part of why people will likely choose not to kind of do it. That's one of the big impediments of it, is that ethnography in particular, but even qualitative interviews and even document analysis, it's an incredible amount of time in the data collection process, right? And so that's where kind of making this distinction, I think, between data analysis and data collection. And so a lot of the time is spent just in the field, right? You are the tool. So you are in the field, you know, and this is really based off the document based aspect of this research. I probably wouldn't do a living code book for my interviews, although I could. I think it just depends. I'm not at that stage yet. And so for me, I think what it's about is it's about thinking how, you know, pushing back against this universalizing language of like transparency in science, because what I think it reveals is like different research assistants see different things. And it's not that one is right or wrong. It's not that one has a bias and one does not, right? Like I really kind of reject this aspect of that there is this pure objectivity, but it's a way to talk about how people's positionalities or their social positions give insights into different things, whether that's embodied knowledge, whether that's knowledge about US empire and seeing broader like patterns, like, oh, that you can also see this here and there. So for me, I think the decision-making process is super important. And I personally, I think that it's more efficient for quantitative researchers because, you know, part of the goal of transparency there and kind of the data analysis aspect is you can just rerun the same models, right? You can like do this, and that's part of this, but both the goal of qualitative research and even qualitative coding is not to, in my perspective, rerun models, right? Like the goal of qualitative research, my opinion, is not reproducibility. It's not, and reproducibility has not always been one of the standards of what science is considered, right? And it's not generalizability in the same way that quantitative scholars talk about. For me, it's really about theory building. It's about understanding. It's about texture. It's about understanding how these abstract processes work in real life, and it's messy. So I don't think that really answers your question at all.
Oh, it does. Yeah, you answered it right off the bat. It doesn't.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
but I mean, from someone who is interested in sort of reproducibility and replicability, I mean, if you've documented those decisions and exactly what you used and why certain things were omitted, absolutely that from my perspective would help somebody bring those exact methods to a new data set or a new situation. So.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, and I think that's my point, is that, like, for me, what's important is thinking about the decision-making processes that researchers engage in. Why do we define it in this way? Because often, and these are the conversations I have with the undergraduates I work with, is that these decisions about definition of codes is super important, about what's included and what's not included, right? And so the goal of kind of being transparent is someone could check and you can say, yeah, I agree with that, or, oh, that makes sense. Or if I told you, in my book's appendix, I talk about how, like, one of the things ethnographers in particular grapple with is, like, how do you kind of protect participants' identities, particularly if they are saying things that could get them into trouble, right? So bribery or, whatever, but even reputation matters, right? So they don't want their, cousin in the whole neighborhood to know what they're saying, right? And I say that, and then I say, but I'm not going to tell you whether, and I say different things. People give pseudonyms. Some people change characteristics, right? To a woman to a man to a woman, or whatever, to try to protect identity. But then I say, but I'm not going to tell you what I did, because if I told you I did that in serious matters of XYZ, then a person could go through the book and actually identify the person. And what we're talking about, and Nancy Sheppel, that's not her whole name. What's her name? She has a middle name. That happened in Ireland, and it can cause life or death situations in some cases, but it's also reputational matters, and it's real people's lives. And so for me, I think showing that I've thought about this and thinking about the unintended consequences is really important.
Well, I think Allison has a question.
Yeah, one of the things that came up in what you were just talking about, I remembered that at the beginning you said, this is an option. The Living Codebook is something for you to consider, but it's really project by project. And I was wondering what sense you have at this point about sort of what particular kinds of questions or particular sorts of data make it worth this. And the insight I had from your conversation with Grant is you're essentially talking about, for any given piece of text, you have 3 different people engaging in the coding, and that is a massive expense. And so, when is this, like, it is really important that you build into your grants doing this, and when do you think, a little more optional?
Yeah, let me answer that question, but first, just to get at Grant, I have a paper, I mentioned it in 2018, and I talk about, here are the different ways, transparency, and then I kind of build on that, and this is more decision-making processes, but that there have actually been multiple ways ethnographers in particular have been transparent, right? So if you're interested, I have a 2018 kind of paper on that. In terms of when to do it, the answer I give never satisfies people, and I understand why. And I get this in reviews all the time, but I push back, or I just, people want me to make a stake. They want me to, that's how it's the model of publishing, to be novel and to say, this is what you need to do and when you need to do it and all you need to do. And I think that's unproductive. I think that the publish or perish model and the extreme competition to publish and publish often and to publish fast and to make claims to novelty, which, by the way, I never buy, because I think like anything that's been written has been written about before, and what we can bring is bridging in and together insights. And I actually think that's bad for research. I think that's bad for science, actually. And so our whole profession is built on publishing a lot, at least often say 2 articles a year. And it really is against this kind of thoughtful thinking about how are we getting at our data, thinking through kind of ethical questions, thinking through about positionality. And ultimately, I think it's harmful to science to just constantly produce and not step back and think. So that doesn't really answer your question. The question is, I think I don't like to make broad pronouncements, partly because I don't think universal generalized pronouncements about like, the default of transparency needs to be this, the XYZ needs to be this, because it fails to consider a whole host of factors, the scope of the project, the funding, whether or not like you have the resources to be able to have research assistants, whether or not you have the resources to do all of this, whether or not you have tenure and can take time to do all of this. And also just on the project, like I think that there are different ways. I have a lot of different types of data, and I'm going to use the Living Codebook for some of it and maybe not for all of it. And part of that could be time constraints. Part of that could be just the goal and what I'm trying to do with each particular set of data. And I think that's okay. And I think explaining why I do things, right? And so I think that when we're talking about team research in particular, I think so that's not to say I can't pinpoint what are ways in which that are more prone to kind of thinking about this tool. And that would be primarily team research. Like when you have multiple people involved, it's a way to kind of, I like documentation, because I don't know about any of you. I have 2 kids. I have the pandemic. I wrote this before the pandemic, but I have no sense of time. I don't remember anything. And documentation is really important because you can refer back to. And so what this does is, especially if you're working with people who are at different universities, or even if you're working with kind of, multiple sets of undergraduates, you can, and projects take years at a time. So this is a way to invest in a large scale project, to keep track of decisions, and to be able to kind of do it in a systematic way, and also look back at the decisions that are being made, and also pinpoint why we made the decisions we did, and in doing so, the themes that we saw, the problems that we came about. So for me, this was a very long answer, and the short answer would probably be team research.
Yeah, and I very much take your point about it's not about sort of putting a stake in the sand and being like, this is what everyone needs to do. But yeah, more that sort of intuition that you've developed for yourself about when it makes sense. And I really appreciate the fullness and roundness of that answer. We have a applied research team at Spark, and we do a lot of sort of community projects that involve team coding. And so I'm now thinking about this in relation to our work, and like actually starting to use the Living Codebook for our work. And so if there are others on this call who are thinking you might want to try this out, we can keep talking, and maybe bother Victoria if we get to sort of specific problems or questions. But I'm serious about this, and I hope that if others are, that we can do a little bit of a community of practice and support around it.
Yeah, I would actually love to. So one of the options when you invited me, right, was it could be a workshop, it could be this. I mean, I think with kind of whenever you present a kind of novel tool, right, and not all parts are novel, right, and that's where I feel like it's not. When I mention like I'm suspicious of things that are novels, we're actually pulling on a lot of different people and trying to put it together. I think it's important to kind of explain and to kind of go through the process, but I would love to come for more of a workshop and hands-on, and how can we put this in practice and adapt kind of, because that's really kind of what I'm trying to do with this is this is one model, but this is the process of how we decided it. So how can we adopt it? It's not supposed to be draconian, like you have to have this aspect to be a living code book, but no, it's adapting to like, what are your needs, especially if you're working with community partners, if you're doing community-based resources and you want to kind of really respect and honor kind of our communities and their input, how do you incorporate them in the process? So I would love to come back if you want to invite me back for a workshop kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. I think everyone here, if you're really interested in this, reach out to your networks and see who else might be interested. We have a limited number of projects where there were sort of full teams working on it, but there are a number of people here who I know are fully doing that, and there may be enough of a critical mass to be able to do a really vibrant workshop.
That'd be great. Thanks.
All right, we are almost out of time. Does anyone have a last quick question?
Especially noting how I go around.
So thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, Victoria. If you think of further questions, feel free to email talk.2.spark@mcmaster.ca. Brianna is also going to put up a very simple, literally 1-minute feedback survey that helps us plan for future speakers. And then we host one of these every single Friday, completely different topics. We like to have kind of a fun grab bag. So definitely check out our website, spark.mcmaster.ca/events to see all of the upcoming talks. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, everyone.